Well, you know, when the December 14, 2018 meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee will now come to order. I believe we have a quorum.
Used to get that.
And we'll just get right into what I expect will be the highlight of this morning's board meeting. The first item on our agenda is the Ethics and Responsibilities of the Board of Regents, Part 2 presentation. Executive Director and Corporate Secretary Brian Steeves, Jason Langworthy, Board Associate Policy and Committees. I believe we'll turn it over to Mr. Langworthy.
I'll start off. And then,
We'll turn it over to Mr. Steeves. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and I think we're getting slides pulled up here, but I'll just start off with reminding you that the Board of Regents Policy Code of Ethics for members of the Board of Regents is currently under comprehensive review. That policy has provisions that relate to or are kind of tied into two other board policies. One is called Board of Regents Policy Responsibilities of the Board and Individual Regents, and the other is related to gifts received or given by regents and senior university officials. So in this comprehensive review, we're actually looking at regents' provisions in all three of those policies. Today's conversation will build on the October discussion that you had, which was really more of an introductory conversation about this topic and some of your preliminary preferences related to the Code of Ethics. And today, what we're bringing back is some additional work that's been done in this interim to tee up some questions that would be helpful for us to understand as we try to draft new policy language for your consideration. And so part of what we'll do here is walk through a potential model or framework for that, get your feedback on that model or framework, and then also some other key areas where we need feedback in order to continue the work on the policy. So with that, Mr. Langworthy will walk through some additional information here.
Mr. Langworthy.
Chair Rocha, members of the committee, good morning. From the October meeting, one of the ideas that was brought up is potentially looking at how to restructure the Code of Ethics between policy and what we would call policy plus guidelines. So currently, the three policies that Executive Director Steeves mentioned, all of the principles, definitions, and procedures are included in those three board policies. And working with Chair Rocha, a different structure could be to put some of the current language into policy areas and some of the current language into guideline areas. And we'll talk about the difference between policy and guidelines. And really what we would be looking at is those areas that remain in policy could be objectively determined, and those areas moving to guidelines could be more the process, the procedures, and even a little bit more of guidance for the Code of Ethics or for how the board does its business together. So when we talk about in our current policy structure, and we do have examples of guidelines currently, board policies establish specific principles, definitions, procedures. One procedure is the development of the board's agenda. So certainly we have a procedure within policy that establishes the steps and the pieces to be able to develop the board's agenda. So those are included in board policy. And certainly in the Code of Ethics currently is the conflict of interest procedure for how to determine a conflict of interest. That's currently within board policy. Board policy also identifies areas where guidelines are used to provide processes that implement specific policy principles. And that guideline process is delegated to the Office of the Board of Regents. The Office of the Board of Regents then drafts those guidelines using relevant board and administrative policies and maintains those guidelines for the board. So things like your expense reimbursements, how we do expense reimbursements, that's a guideline that is used and is called for from policy that then the Office of the Board of Regents maintains and certainly uses other university policies to inform. And then certainly you use that when needing to be reimbursed for, say, your mileage. So that's a process that is included in those guidelines for expenses. The other ones that are currently in board policy are our ticket guidelines and processes. The board policy comprehensive review process. So that's a process that certainly you've heard more about, where we try to review the 90 Board of Regents policies every 6 years. So there's a process that we use to work with the policy implementers to ensure that happens. And the two other ones are the presidential performance review process and the presidential compensation setting process. Now, only in specific instances currently, like in the value of a ticket, are portions of guidelines approved by the board. Oftentimes, as I said, those are delegated to the Office of the Board of Regents, and then working within university policy, we create the structure of the guidelines. And other guidelines, like the presidential performance review process or the presidential compensation setting process, establish a process to bring items to the board for approval. So it's basically just a structure that the board, especially within both of those, usually they're like the presidential performance review, there's a committee that then brings forward recommendations and does that review. So it just basically establishes a procedure to use to carry out the board policy. So when thinking about and working with Chair Rocha to think about the structure of putting maybe the code of ethics between a policy plus guidelines, we created a very rough draft that is included in the docket starting on page 4 that includes current language from the 3 policies and new or modified language, and that new or modified language is highlighted. And so I'll turn to page 4 in the docket and briefly walk you through that. So first, we looked at guiding principles, and the guiding principles between the 3 policies, we tried to condense. So you can see the column on the left is where we would think potential policy language would be, and the column on the right is where potential guideline language should be. So the potential policy language and the guiding principles, we use some existing language. We also then added in that the board acts in good faith in accordance with the fiduciary duties of care, loyalty, and obedience, which this committee discussed in October. Currently, there's no kind of calling out those 3 duties within board policy. We felt then it would be important to define what we mean by the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. So this is some language that was taken from an HEB Board of Directors statement and modified slightly to put it into sort of the context that we would use it. But is just an example of where then we could define what those fiduciary duties are so that all of the regents would understand that and be able to articulate that. But that felt more on the guideline side. Now, certainly this is a good example where we can discuss and we can think about what should move over either sort of into the left column or from the left column to the right column. In terms of the responsibilities, the current policy responsibilities of the board and individual regents has 28 different responsibilities that are listed out. And so when we looked at those, many of them are either redundant within the policy itself or are redundant to other responsibilities that are mentioned in other board policies. So the list here is an attempt to try to distill down both the essential ones, and certainly this is, again, a very rough draft, so we could continue to add and modify as necessary. And also to take some of the responsibilities and move them into between policy language and potential guideline language. Again, trying to determine what would be objective and what would be sort of good guidance to the board. And so you can see on the left hand, there are 2 modified ones that took current language but try to modify it to be a little bit more clearer. And then on the right, there are a number that are the highlighted that have taken multiple ones and condensed them down to try to create, again, a more streamlined policy so it didn't quite become the lengthy list of 28 that we have today. But of course, we could continue to add and modify those as needed. One, I'll point out, identify risks to the success of the university's mission and work with the president to mitigate those risks. That's a new one. Certainly the board has been discussing those, how to approach and look at risk. And so that felt like one that was missing from the current list, but would probably be more on the guidance side. From there, much of the language following is current language. So if you look at the definitions that come from the Code of Ethics on the next, on page 5, and then through page 6, that's all current language that we would carry forward. And again, we'll talk about some additional areas for discussion, might modify these items, but currently this is the language that appears in policy. On page 7, one of the things that is included in the gifts policy is under D, that a gift shall not include plaques, trophies, mementos, hats, or similar items of reasonable value, but there's no definition of what reasonable value is. So we put in $75 right now. That could be adjusted either way, but we felt it was important, just as when we're asked by members of the board of what is reasonable value, how can we make sure that the policy is being followed. It felt important to at least put on a dollar amount there. So that's the only change there on page 7. On page 8, then we start with financial disclosures, which is not required under Minnesota law, but is required under board policy. And that's the current language again. In gifts, this is where we start to see our first current guideline language that's already in place, our Regent ticket guidelines and processes. And that is called for there to provide a process for tickets to university events that you attend as a part of your oversight responsibilities. So those are listed there, and certainly we have those on file currently. Excuse me. In terms of expenses, you can see here that this is the current language, and reimbursement for expenses incurred while representing the university in an official capacity is in accordance with guidelines on file with the Office of the Board of Regents. Certainly these are guidelines that I'm sure all of you know very well. And again, those are on file there. And we just make note of that, that they are currently in guideline language. On page 9, excuse me, we move to the conflict of interest procedures. And again, these are the current text. We did move over one piece, the recusal. That language felt more like guidance language than sort of the procedure, the specific procedure language that's on the left-hand side of the page. But that is the current language, and that continues on to page 10. Then we move to university employment. That has not changed. Annual review of policy, that is also not changed. Communication, this is a slightly modified version of what's in the role, the responsibilities of the board in individual regions. The current language is that the chair of the board is the only person authorized to speak for the board. What we tried to do is strike a balance there between the chair of the board is the only person authorized to speak for the board on actions taken by the board. Members of the board may speak as individuals, but shall clarify that they are speaking on their behalf and not for the board. So if a regent wants to certainly offer their perspective, that they are making it clear that they are speaking for themselves and not on behalf of the board, that only the chair speaks on behalf of the board. So that's the current kind of very rough draft structure that we have that could potentially be used as a way to restructure the policies between policy and guidelines. And again, we have some other open areas. There's some pieces I think that we could flex back and forth between the two columns. We certainly would be eager to hear that from you. Now, we have a few additional areas for discussion, and I'll let Executive Director Steeves talk about those.
Mr. Steeves.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So in addition to the language that Mr. Langworthy walked through that was modified language, we're certainly open to any feedback you'd have on that, and the question of whether having having this bifurcated, board policy and guidelines framework is the right framework moving forward. So those are two questions that we invite feedback on. And in addition to those, we have a list on this slide of additional areas where it would be helpful to get feedback from the committee with regard to what you're thinking in terms of policy language in these spaces. So one is related to conflicts of interest related to a Regents family member being a university employee. Modified language on how Regents communicate with external groups, including partisan political activity. There were and have been provisions related to that in policy currently, and so that's an open area of discussion. Guidance on communication between Regents, and this was just a shorthand way of saying in the current responsibilities of the board and individual regents, there are several bullet points that relate to collegiality between regents and kind of in the function of the board, and so this is partly a way to get at what would you like in policy related to that. Another one is a formal process related to disputes if needed, or right now you have established in your bylaws that Robert's Rules of Order will guide your deliberations, and buried inside Robert's Rules is a way to resolve disputes. I don't believe it's been used by this board, but that could be a potential fallback. It's simply that in each of these areas, you should be conscious about what it is you want to write down and hold yourselves to as standards, because later when there is a conflict that comes up, or when there is some dispute or a disagreement with regard to how one or more members of the board are functioning or operating, it's this policy that you'll have to go back to as the collective agreement that you have with one another. So in each of these cases, that's the framework you're trying to establish, is what is your collective agreement to one another as to how you're going to function and operate on the board with regard to ethics or kind of these various boundaries that you'd be setting. Finally, or two others, a process or expectation for how information requests are made or fulfilled for regents, and then any other gaps that you might identify. So we would really be open to listening to any feedback that the committee has in any of these areas or areas that Mr. Langworthy covered, so that we can try to develop a draft that meets your interests and bring that back to you for review.
Thank you. So good comprehensive review. I would ask Regent Beeson if he has any comments before we move into a broader discussion. Regent Beeson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've had the opportunity to work with the chair and staff on development of this framework, and it is a framework that we're talking about. If you step back, the goal of trying to consolidate several documents into one, I think, is worthy, and then clarifying the difference between policy and guidelines and guiding principles and definitions and what's law versus what's subject to Robert's Rules. I think all that can create clarity, and then we focus on sort of the content issues, the issues that Mr. Steeves has raised. But I think it's a good starting point for us to work on between now and in February. I would reiterate, people have comments. Talk to the chair about those, what they'd like to see, what they see is missing. I think for today it feels, we're trying to get some directional support on where this process is going.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. And just to follow up on that, beside the fact that we go through and review, our staff does an amazing job of going through and reviewing our policies as a whole, this obviously being an area that would be subject to a normal review, but then recognizing, as Mr. Langworthy described, some overlap, not really, really haven't run into a lot of inconsistency, although you can find some areas like with employment, family member employment, for instance, you've got all this language that sort of walks you right up to the edge, but never actually defines how you handle, certain specific considerations, and just making sure that we're understanding that so that there isn't a lack of understanding as we as Regent Beeson and I were working with staff on this, we want to make, we weren't necessarily looking to throw out a jump ball, but at the same time, we want to make sure that because this stuff is so important, that everybody is having an opportunity to weigh in on issues of concern. We certainly can go forward and take any comments now, put together essentially a proposal, and then now you've got something that you can really kind of sink your teeth into and evaluate and suggest that there may be some places that need changing, some strengthening, maybe some things are misplaced. But it'll certainly be a collaborative process with all members of the board participating with the guidance of our staff. With that, I will open it to Regent Simonson.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Rocha. I really appreciate you doing this because I've had a number of questions. Most recently, one was with regard to family. How far do you go? Wasn't a big deal, but I got a grandnephew that's in the Carlson School. And so we had something that we discussed. So how far do you go out with family before it becomes a conflict? I hardly ever talk to him, maybe once or twice a year. So, but what's family?
Thank you, Regent Simonson. And along with just, suggesting maybe you keep in better contact with your family. That's right. Now that you have a reason to drive up here. But I think there are actually sort of two components to that question. One is the definition of family that would implicate some conflict policy. The other one is what activity is simply being a student here going to trigger a policy. And so that's helpful. We'll make sure that in the process that we have those matters defined. Regent Simonson.
One follow-up. I've had questions before. I was on a Dean's Advisory Committee, and I reached out to Legal Counsel Peterson for advice on that. Is that the appropriate way to go? I ended up resigning from that board, but is that the proper way? If I have a question, reaching out to Counsel Peterson?
Regent Simonson, I'm sort of stepping into the mantle here. I would say you always have the opportunity to reach out to counsel, and counsel, I think, will guide you if that isn't the right choice. Otherwise, I would suggest if you talk to Director Steves or talk to folks at the board office, they will, obviously, if your concern is something with the board office, the general counsel might be the first step, but otherwise, I think the board office can always help guide you in where you would seek your guidance. Mr. Steves, would you like to add on to that at all?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I think that's right. I mean, we will always serve as a resource and a guide. I think in this case, specifically related to conflicts of interest, the general counsel by board policy plays a unique role, and so is certainly the right place to seek advice related to that.
Thank you. Regent Simonson, any further questions? Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. And also, I want to echo Regent Simonson's comments. I think this is really appreciated and really good work for the reasons that Regent Beeson stated, the clarification of policy versus principle and the opportunity to kind of think about what's in here. I think it's really good. A couple of comments. I think that the policy draft does say selection and monitoring of the president as a key key one, and there's a statement in there about monitoring of performance, and I think those should absolutely be there, and I think a lot of governance people would say those are the two. In many ways, those are the two primal one. I guess I would suggest that a little more clarity that it's strategic oversight. That is a primary obligation of the board, which I think is kind of captured, but I'd be clear there. And then the last point, there's a third area I think that is emerging, sort of my reading of what I read that's emerging in this sort of topic. And it has to do with culture and ethical culture. And I think the reason it's coming about is you look at Wells Fargo, look at higher ed, last 4 or 5 years, really bad things happened. And in the end, the board was held responsible. It was a you should have known. And whether that's fair or not, I think increasingly there's an expectation that boards are promoting and evaluating and ensuring that there's some sort of ethical and values framework that guides the institution. And I don't know how to word it or where to go with it, but it does seem increasingly that when things go wrong, boards are being held accountable. And whether that's right or not, or fair or not, and I think there's an emergent thought that maybe that should be captured somehow in this work that we're doing right now.
Thank you, Regent Powell. My initial response is there's the reality that the world is requiring it, whether you're saying it or not.
Yeah.
There's also the prospect that by saying it, you increase the likelihood you'll be held accountable for it.
I agree.
And from, certainly my perspective, I think that's a good thing, right? I think that placing that foremost in front of us. So certainly Mr. Steves and the office staff, Mr. Langworthy, Ms. Dirksen will work to come up with some language. There may be some out there already, but certainly taking that into consideration, maybe finding even some of the judicially imposed language, if you will, we might be able to put some together. But Regent Beeson and I will certainly ensure that that's something that is taken into account and have something in front of you next. Regent Johnson, are you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under what circumstances, by way of the law or regulation or policy, may a regent be removed from one's office? If I've been a bad boy, not paying X number of parking tickets, or if I'm a convicted felon, does that preclude me from being a regent? What's the standard? I'm not talking about anybody. I'm just asking the question: how can one be removed as a regent? Is there a policy? And I don't think any vote one takes would, cause removal or comments, but violation of the law.
Regent Johnson, and this may be putting General Counsel Peterson on the spot. I guess two observations. One is I want to make sure we stick with, kind of stay on the topic here, because I'm sure everybody would welcome additional time if we don't have to consume the entire time of this committee. But because I think that falls a bit outside of what our policy is going to state, unless we decide we want to try to be aggressive and put a removal provision in our policy, which doesn't currently exist. But I think it would run into state constitutional and state statutory provisions that go to levels of, high crimes and misdemeanors, for instance, as to, under what circumstances would somebody be removed. Mr. Peterson, if you don't have any comment, we can take a pass and seek to develop an answer to that question. But if you have comments right now, I would certainly welcome you to the board. Mr. Peterson.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair Rocha. This is a question of uncharted territory in terms of the constitutional autonomy of this board and your ability to regulate yourselves, running alongside the fact that all of you have been appointed by the legislature and you're creatures of the legislature. So to the extent we're talking removal, that runs to sort of who has the inherent power to act in that fashion, given that there's no clear statement in statute or in the Constitution about the question you've asked, Regent Johnson. So I think, what's competing here is whether or not that potential power kind of rests with this board as it's part of its constitutional autonomy, or whether it would necessarily involve this board making a recommendation to the legislature, with the legislature taking that step. In the meantime, in terms of, what's before you in terms of your own policies, maybe the more likely question is, what remedies do you have short of removal to take action with regard to any breach of these guidelines and policies that you develop? And I think that's where you have full sway to decide whether or not you want to exercise some authority to better define when you are going to use a censure authority or take some action in order to remove someone from a committee assignment or et cetera. So I think there are, a lot of remedies that you could develop short of removal that might also be, a useful question for you as to whether or not you want to kind of build that into your policies or not.
Thank you. Regent Johnson? Does that address your question, or do you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. From time to time, we see other universities and regions, and I'm always curious about that, and approach it from the situation, what if, and if we make some policies prior to an occurrence, it's easier to deal with, so we don't have to make the decision based on personalities or that kind of thing. I'm not looking at anybody, I'm just asking the generic question about how that might evolve, in the future. I was thinking of another university. A regent had a sweetheart deal with a third party on some land acquisition, and the regents themselves voted to expel the regent in another state. I remember reading the article. I don't know if we'd have that authority or not. It's part of our behavior and expectations and the ethics in which we ought to be aware of.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. And certainly it does make sense to seek clarity on these issues when you're not stuck with the passion of the moment. And right now I would suggest that that's the case. And following on Mr. Peterson, and he certainly can comment to this as well, we don't know what rules they necessarily have, either state statutory, whether it's public, private. I don't have enough information to really be able to draw a conclusion. However, I do know there would be certain laws of general application in Minnesota with respect to some of these conflict issues where you could rise to an issue. But Mr. Peterson, if you have further comment, I certainly would give you the floor. Otherwise, we'll move to other questions. Thank you very much. On this topic, is that Regent Beeson, and then I've got a couple of other folks that would like to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Regent Johnson's question is really going to be answered through a formal legal opinion, and we, might or might not decide that we need that clarity. But one of the things we've discovered in preliminary conversations is this overlay of Robert's Rules of Orders, which do, because the chairs right now, just through our little working group, have guidelines for dealing with cases. And I haven't read those to know, how it deals with refusal or removal. And but if we're gonna keep the Robert's Rules of Orders, and we either have them in their entirety, or we have to be specific as to which ones we decide to adopt and which ones we don't. So that's out there as an opportunity, but also adds a little complexity.
And thank you, Regent Beeson. And there is a policy. It's fairly reasoned, providing an opportunity for hearing, et cetera, before taking some sort of action. The challenge, of course, is that when you move past the censure to removal, you start to run into the constitutional and statutory questions that Mr. Peterson addressed. And so we can look into that question as well. Whether we can get to that level of granularity or specific provision by February remains to be seen. That may be an issue that continues on beyond our proposal that would be coming before the board. Thank you. Regent Sviggum.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Adding no clarity to Senator Johnson's question, and from a few years past, my memory is not always as clear as it ought to be, but a few years, I did request the Senate Council that very question. And I'm sure I have the memo at home, but Senate Council basically responded and said that there is no process at all, no legal process at all for a member of this board of regents to be removed from office. There's no process. So that's the only small clarity I can give to you regarding, and that was a Senate Council opinion. My advice to you, Mr. Chair, is as you, the Vice Chair, look at these additional areas for discussion. As I look at the bullet points here, excuse me, I would suggest to you humbly that the answer in many of the cases is public disclosure. Whether it be a grandnephew that works, or whether it be a contribution to a congressional candidate, a political activity, or whatever, public disclosure, I think, is the answer in most cases. That if the public is pretty astute, the public is pretty sharp, and as long as they know what's going on, as long as the public understands, they'll understand the grandnephew having a job. They will understand that. On the other hand, if they, have a regent calling a dean to give a person a job that happens to be a grandnephew, that might be a different case. So decide on the side of public disclosure. I think I would give the advice to you and to Mr. Beeson as you look into these general discussion questions and the actions we'll take.
Thank you, Regent Sviggum. I think that's good counsel. We've got several others at this point. I've got Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Few comments. I think understanding of the Roberts Rule process makes good sense to see if that's something that we want to move with, and I think that the question is appropriate in that it might fall within that process that we're looking at as far as Robert's Rules of Order goes. Regent Simonson, where in my world everybody's family, so I got a conflict with everybody here. But I do know that there's an administration policy around this, so it might be a good place to start the conversation is to look at the administration policy and see if we can adopt some things from there. I think to Regent Powell's comment, in full agreement, and it might even be able to fall under the duty of obedience guideline there, adding a little bit of information around, the culture of ethical behavior, if you will. The question that I have with that and with a lot of this is then how do we as regents do that, right? So if we add something around ensuring that there's a good culture within the university, then where is the line of saying, how do I still govern as a regent without going into the acting piece of ensuring that this is being done within the management realm? And I think that's where the challenging part goes, which then leads me to the kind of broader comment, which is so much of this is interpretable by the person who's reading it. And when I read duty of loyalty, for example, the way that what is reasonably believed to be in the best interest of the university, in my perspective, many of you would likely disagree with. And so this is what I'm having a hard time saying, not to say what's the point of this, because there's obviously meaningful reason for having it, yet it's the action piece that I'm struggling to figure out how we do this in a way that everyone agrees. Yeah, I don't have a question, but just some thoughts.
Thank you, Regent Omari. And that's the challenge, right? I think this is really trying to find kind of establishing the rules of the game where you can have honest disagreement about what is in the best interest of the university, but as long as everybody is approaching it from the perspective of the best interest, that's how we, I think, collectively engage in that discussion. And as we see with votes that are not unanimous, that people will just sometimes have to agree to disagree, and you move forward. So, Regent Omari, please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but I also don't think it's that simple. I mean, I think things can go to a vote and we can disagree, but that doesn't get to what I think is the spirit of some of this, which is one might say, Abdul, I don't believe that you're acting in good faith of the university because you think that the university should only admit people from Illinois, right? I'm just making this up because I like Illinois for some reason, right? Not really, Ms. Dirksen.
Thank you for clarifying that.
But so I guess, yes, votes will solve matters of action, yet the spirit of where this is not solved by votes, if that makes sense. So, yeah, just trying to process.
Thank you. And obviously Regent Beeson and I and the board office, if you have thoughts and want to sort of clarify further, please do, and we'll incorporate that in our process. All right, Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Back on the topic of removal, I was trying to get at it while General Counsel Peterson was still at the table, but I see he's still in the room. I don't recall exactly when this happened, but I believe we were advised at one time that repeated open meeting law violations could result in removal. And there was a process that was detailed for that and number of violations, et cetera. I don't know if it was General Counsel Peterson or his predecessor who actually advised us of that, but that did happen at one point.
Thank you, Regent Hsu, in anticipating the response and offering the opportunity to correct. In a conversation about our open meeting law obligations, I believe we were informed that statute provides that public officials with 3 or more violations of open meeting law may be removed. And so that would trigger it under that statute. That's not a region policy or a university policy, but that is part of a state statute, which would appear to be a law of general application that could implicate a member of this board were such a finding to be made. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that that was something that we had heard at one point.
Okay, so that would be sort of one area, but again, you have a specific statutory provision that provides the basis and the remedy, which doesn't exist for some of the other considerations I think that have been brought up here today. All right, Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Just a comment picking up on the thread of this discussion that Regent Johnson, I think, appropriately and put into play as the slide before us has these bullets. I think it makes sense, and I want to amplify the point you made, Regent Rocha, a minute ago, that if you're going to go through the work to restructure all this, to coordinate and codify it, so to speak, in a way that makes sense, we should at least have a well-informed dialogue about removal and address it to your point, your very, very good point, when it's not in the heat of a moment where somebody's looking to apply a policy that doesn't exist to a challenging set of facts and circumstances. So doing all this and not tackling that with perhaps some kind of a legal opinion, I don't know whether it's the Senate Counsel, the Attorney General, our own counsel, something that would help bring to light what the interplay of the Constitution and the law is and our own constitutional autonomy, coupled with the look at Robert's rules, and doing that when we don't have anything before us makes a ton of sense. I think to go through all this work and not at least inform everybody about that area of law or non-law or Constitution, whatever governs, would be a missed opportunity, at least to level set the board as to what the rules of the road are, if there are any. So thank you.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. And there's even I think there's somewhat of a question. I know over time we've had members for whatever reason leave the board, and there's really not even a statutory specific statute specifically explaining how you do that. It's been done. A letter's being provided, and then the legislature votes, and nobody in society has brought a legal challenge to the effect of that. So it just sort of happened as it's happened. But I would engage the conversation with board leadership, the chair specifically, who brings up the apt point that we could ask our general counsel to provide us that. My expectation is it's going to have a certain flavor of a first impression type question, because as Mr. Peterson said, we don't have experience with that of late, but we definitely can get that opinion together so that, as you say, we have a common understanding of where we are with respect to that. All right, I will move to Regent Cohen.
Thanks, Chair Rocha. I just, for those of you who are not on the audit committee, I thought that maybe it would be interesting to know that, and was going to be part of my report later on, that the Chief Compliance Officer, Coomer, did present to the audit committee that they've been working on a more formal ethics program since 2016 for the university, And we're one of the few universities right now that doesn't have a formal ethics program. And I thought perhaps, I mean, in looking at what Regent Powell said about the ultimate responsibility remains with the Board of Regents, that some conversation with Compliance Officer Coomer might help in how do we look at sort of an institutional kind of code of ethics or something that would include the board, which might shed some light on some of the areas we're discussing.
Thank you, Regent Cohen. I think that's an excellent idea, an excellent point, and Regent Beeson and I will connect with you, in the board office, we'll connect with you at some point between now and in this process to get clarity on that and get access to that. We're not on audit committee, neither of us, so your insight will be very, very helpful with that. All right, and Regent Beeson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Regent Hsu's comment made me think about another formatting issue. At the end of the day, I don't think this can look like a sort of a sentencing guideline, a grid. You know, if we violate data privacy or open meeting law, or it has to be, you know, this is going to have to be more around principles. And one of the areas we talked about too was having, you know, in terms of disputes, maybe a supermajority, or I mean, it has to be, in my view, it has to be a high level of the board agreeing to whatever you know consequences are meted out. But that's something we can control. How, you know, what does that look like if we decide to go down the road with these disputes?
Thank you, Regent Beeson. I'm struck a little bit when during a deployment to southern Iraq, in the operational chief role, I had the opportunity to brief the commanders of the Iraqi special forces from across the country who had gathered in Basra to talk about the agreement between the United States and Iraq. And it had all of these provisions about interacting in between countries and so on. And I ended up with about 20 questions, and all 20 of them were related to under what circumstances could the Iraqis execute an American. And so I look at this and say, you know, I understand that there is this idea of, well, how do we get to this removal process? And I think that is important. I get a bit nervous about it because sometimes I look at that and say, is that really, you know, is that my first focus, is how do I sort of take punitive action against a member? But that being said, I also do agree that it is much better to have that conversation at a time when you're not sort of charged up over some dispute between the board, and that it's not a matter of, as one of our colleagues put it, settling scores, but really a function of orderly operation and ensuring that we are a full board of people operating under the with the best interest of the university in mind. So we'll take a look at that, as well as the other areas that are, you know, currently being developed. And please don't consider your input limited to this conversation. We certainly would be open to additional commentary and input from people. In the meantime, are there further questions or comments from members of the committee? Regent Cohen.
Because of Regent Simonson's comments, and then where's Regent Swigum? He just left for a minute, just when I needed. I thought, for full disclosure, I just found out yesterday, my son told me that my granddaughter, who is here at the university as a junior, is working on the university grounds crew. I had no idea, no influence, but full disclosure.
But Regent Cohen, it's not because you don't talk to her often, right?
I talk to her, have tea with her, see her often.
Well, thank you, Regent Cohen. We will get a legal opinion from Mr. Peterson as to whether there is any action this board will have to take, but we do appreciate your disclosure. So, Regent Anderson.
You asked about, thanks, Chair Roche, you asked about Regent Svigum. I think he went to get more applications for his family.
Very good. All right. No further questions. We'll move to our final item, information items. Mr. Steeves.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, continuing the pattern that we've used in the past, we have two policies that are being reported back to you as having undergone a comprehensive review, but there are no changes being recommended at this point in time. So that you are aware that they're going back into the queue and would be reviewed again in 6 years. It would be Board of Regents policy possession and carrying of weapons and Board of Regents policy safety of minors. So both of those policies from a comprehensive review standpoint would go back in the queue with no changes. But if there were changes off cycle that were desired, they can always come back for consideration.
Regent Omari.
Yes, thank you, Chair Rocha. I just have a question about the possession and carrying of weapons. As I read through this, I'm not finding it. So just for point of clarification, if someone has a permit to carry a firearm, are they able to carry on university property?
Mr. Steves, it's a good question, and I had a similar question because you've got the conjunctive component of that language. Mr. Steves, do you have a thought, and we might need to bring up
Mr. Chair, this is one of those phone a friend moments, so I don't know. I don't know the answer.
I think the answer is no, but.
So Mr. Peterson, if you're interested in engaging otherwise, and again, we can certainly follow up.
I think the answer is no.
After, well, yeah, so the question, of course, is somebody could read the policy and suggest that those are each separate conditions under which a person could carry, official duties and a permit. Or you could say, these are the people that can carry, people who have a reason and people who have a permit. So I think that there is a question with, when I read that did strike me as well. Regent Beeson, did you want to make a comment to this?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Regent Omari, I remember this subject came up when the Vikings were renting our stadium, and we had whether, I think the answer is no, but in that case it was whether non-university police could carry weapons into the stadium in their own civilian, in a civilian capacity, and that was I don't remember how that got decided, but.
So maybe some clarity, Mr. Chairman, maybe just some clarity in the policy might be worth exploring.
Yeah, Regent Omari, again, Mr. Peterson, did you want to make a comment to this point, or? And I don't remember, obviously the stadium would create a difference because you're walking through a metal detector, right? So it's you're going to confront the question. Whether you're sitting in a classroom, it may be a different question. Mr. Peterson, if you're familiar with the language, I don't want to put you on the spot if we want to take a step back, but if you've got thoughts now, they'd be welcome.
As a general matter, the answer is no. In the Vikings case, the court ruled that we were in a different realm because we were engaged in a lease arrangement that involved a commercial activity separate and apart from the university's own mission, and so as a result, the court overturned what had been, the university determination in that particular case. I think what might be helpful on this question is if we provide the board a privileged memorandum discussing a little bit more of the context of this question and how it's been addressed in both administration policy as well as in, that particular case involving the Vikings, because I think that would be informative to all of you in terms of where the university stands vis-a-vis the Minnesota State college system, for example, and then also vis-a-vis state law as it applies to businesses and other entities in general.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Although I would also add that going to Regent Omari's perspective and my own, reading of the rule, we might want to consider language that makes it clearer. Because obviously having good policy includes people being able to read it and virtually everyone understanding it. But to have somebody read it and think that this gives them the right to carry under that second phrase, and then obviously be penalized for it because they misread the rule, that's different than someone who just walks through the rule. So we might want to take a look at that language and just make it crystal clear under what circumstances somebody would be so authorized so that somebody can't make the argument that they were confused by the language of the policy. Regent Omari, okay, very good.
Chair Rocha, we will speak to that as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Peterson.
Can I comment on this?
Regent Omari, please.
Chair Rocha, I'm just, I'm thinking and reflecting on a conference colleague institution, if you will, as I look at the safety of minors policy. Generally speaking, from my read on it, it seems appropriate. I would just perhaps ask that we look at any adjustments that Penn State may have made to their safety of minors policy when they were going through their review of the situation there, just to make sure that because I believe theirs is best practice at this point. So if we haven't done that, I'd suggest that might be a good way to go, just to make sure that ours is in line with what they came out with as adjustments after they went through what they had going.
Thank you. Mr. Steves?
Mr. Chair, Regent Omari, I do recall that this policy was adopted after the Penn State situation was known, and it was identified then as a gap that we did not have in our policies, and so this policy was then written and added to our library.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Further comments from members of the board? Mr. Steves, do you have anything additional?
I do not.
All right, nothing additional. Any further comments, questions, or discussion for the good of this committee? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.